The Dakota wind cut through the landscape like a cavalry saber. However, inside the hillside, Jonah Blackridge felt only a whisper of cold. "They're watching again," Eliza said gently, her gaze locked on the rough plank table where she was kneading bread dough. Through the little window carved into the stone front wall, she could see 3 horsemen on the ridge, a quarter-mile away. Homesteaders, come to gawk at the Blackridges, living like badgers in a pit. Jonah stood in the doorway to their dugout. A circular wooden door set into a stone wall was the only visible face of their home. Behind him, the structure delved 15 feet into the south-facing slope of a Dakota mountainside. Above his head, robust timber ribs arched, sinking into packed sod and earth, hidden beneath the winter grass. It was January 1873, and they had been living in their underground home for 4 months. 4 months of muttering, mockery, and isolation from the other settlers who had built traditional frame cottages on the open prairie. "Let them watch," Jonah murmured, his worn face set with the same resolve that had carried him through 5 years as a cavalry scout on these very plains. At 34, he'd learned to trust what the land taught over what people said. The memory of last May was still sharp. Jonah and Eliza had stood on this same hillside with a land office surveyor, a man named Marcus Webb. The Dakota summer was already showing its teeth 90 degrees by mid-morning with a wind that never stopped. Webb, mopping sweat from his forehead, was skeptical. "Mr. Blackridge," he'd said, "homesteaders file on bottomland, near water, on flat ground suitable for plowing." But Jonah had knelt, running his hand through the thick prairie grass on the hillside's southern slope. "This hill faces south," he explained. "It blocks the north wind. The grade's gentle enough to dig into without risk of collapse. There's a spring at the base. See that line of cottonwoods, and look at this soil." He'd pulled back the sod to reveal 2 feet of rich, dark earth before hitting clay. "This isn't just a building site. This is insulation. This is protection. This is survival." Webb had looked at Eliza, clearly expecting her to be the voice of reason. She stood there in her simple calico dress and sunbonnet, her practical boots dusty from the long wagon journey from Iowa. She met his gaze steadily. "My father farmed for 40 years in Iowa," Eliza had said. "He lost 3 barns to tornadoes, 1 house to fire, and nearly lost the family twice to winter freezes when the stove couldn't keep up with the cold. Mr. Blackridge's plan makes sense to anyone who's actually tried to survive a prairie winter." Webb had filed the claim, but not without telling everyone at the land office about Blackridge's burrow. The mockery started immediately, but the work started even faster. Jonah had learned earth-sheltered construction from a Pawnee scout and a German engineer at Fort Abraham Lincoln. Eliza brought her father's carpentry skills and a sharp intelligence that saw the solid logic in Jonah's plan. They began by marking out the dimensions, 18 feet wide, 24 feet deep into the hill, with the entrance facing southeast. Using a surveyor's level Jonah had traded for, they established the slope for proper drainage. The digging was back-breaking. They started with pickaxes, breaking through 6-inch thick sod, then dug through rich earth into yellow clay. Jonah rigged a scoop, pulled by their horse, Ember, to haul out the loosened earth. Each day meant thousands of pickaxe swings and endless shoveling. Eliza's hands blistered, then calloused, then grew strong. By early June, they had excavated the full 15-foot depth. The cavity was precisely level with a gentle slope toward the entrance. The next phase was the front wall. For 3 weeks, they gathered glacial stones using Ember and a stone boat. Eliza's father had been a Pennsylvania stonemason, and she recalled the skills he'd taught her. The mortar was her own formula, 3 parts sand, 1 part lime, mixed with water and clay. They built the wall stone by stone, 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the top. They left openings for a door and 2 windows. By late June, the 8-foot-tall stone wall stood complete. Now came the most critical part, the roof. A conventional dugout used simple poles covered with sod, but those flat roofs leaked, sagged under snow, and often collapsed. Jonah had seen too many failed dugouts with caved-in roofs. He wanted something better, a curved arch that would distribute weight efficiently and shed water naturally. The design was adapted from Pawnee earth lodges. They needed substantial timber. Jonah made 3 trips to the cottonwoods 20 miles away, cutting and hauling 12 logs, each 10 inches in diameter and 20 feet long. Back at their site, they cut each log in half lengthwise, creating 24 half-round timbers. Jonah marked the gentle arch he wanted, and they began the painstaking work of sawing and hewing. Each of the 8 curved ribs took a full day to shape. Precision was essential. By mid-July, the ribs were ready. They set support posts along the center line with a ridgepole on top. Each rib rested on the stone wall at the front and a back beam at the rear, all secured to the ridgepole. With the ribs in place, spaced 3 feet apart, Jonah added horizontal purlins, creating a grid framework like the hull of an upside-down boat. The roof went on in layers. First, rough-cut planks, with the gaps caulked with clay and grass. Over that, they laid tar paper for waterproofing. Then came a 12-inch thick layer of the prairie sod they'd saved, laid grass side up, so the roots would continue to live and hold the earth together. Finally, 2 more feet of loose earth, sloped for drainage. When they finished, the roof was invisible from 50 yards away, looking like just another part of the natural hillside. The chimney required special attention. A black metal stovepipe ran from the stove up through all the roof layers, protected by a sheet metal and clay assembly to prevent fire and water from getting in. By early August, the structure was enclosed. Now came the interior finishing. They covered the packed earth floor with flat stones set in sand, creating a clean, level surface. The earth walls were plastered with a mixture of clay and lime, then whitewashed. This brightened the interior significantly and helped control moisture. The rounded door was built from thick pine boards, hung on heavy iron strap hinges. The windows were covered with oiled paper stretched across wooden frames. Glass was an unaffordable luxury. Inside, Jonah built the furniture, a simple bed frame, a table, 2 chairs, and shelves along the walls. At the very back of the dugout, he excavated an additional alcove into the hillside to create a root cellar, where the temperature would stay cool and even, perfect for storing vegetables, milk, butter, and meat. The stove arrived in mid-August, hauled from Yankton in pieces, and assembled inside. It was an expensive Castian model that took a significant portion of their savings, but it was absolutely essential. By late August, they were ready to move in. Everything they owned fit into their wagon: clothes, tools, Eliza's mother's iron cookware, Jonah's rifle, and Eliza's precious books, all wrapped in oilcloth. They had seeds for next year's garden, a small bag of flour, cornmeal, salt pork, beans, and dried apples. Their first night in the dugout was strange and wonderful. Outside, the summer heat lingered, but inside their earth-sheltered home, with 4 feet of earth on all sides, the temperature was a comfortable 60 degrees. The interior was just 6.5 feet tall at the center, sloping down toward the walls, but it felt cozy rather than cramped. "It works," Eliza had said, lying on their new bed and looking up at the whitewashed ceiling. "It works," Jonah had replied, but the nearby settlement did not see it that way. When neighbors came to visit, their reactions ranged from pity to open scorn. "Living like prairie dogs," one homesteader had scoffed after a brief look inside. "My wife would never agree to live in a hole in the ground. It is not civilized." She went on about the lack of good windows, the dim light, the dirt floors, and the smell of soil, damp, and smoke. "Don't you have any pride?" Ada met her gaze and replied, "Pride doesn't keep you warm in January when the wind is howling. Pride doesn't cut your firewood needs by 3/4, and pride won't save your family if your frame house catches fire from an overheated stove." But the damage was done. The Blackridges were seen as strange, primitive, even a little unhinged. Social invitations stopped. The circuit preacher even delivered a sermon about how God gave man dominion over the land, not in order to burrow into it like an animal. They planted a late garden with potatoes, turnips, carrots, and onions, all perfect for their root cellar. He hunted deer and antelope, smoking the meat in an outdoor pit. Ada sold eggs from their 6 chickens, which were safely housed in a small coop attached to the back of their dugout, sharing the earth's warmth. As autumn set in, they watched their neighbors scramble to prepare for winter. Frame houses got extra layers of tar paper. Barns were filled with hay. Huge stacks of wood grew beside every home. A typical frame house on the prairie needed 12 to 15 cords of wood to survive a Dakota winter. The labor involved was immense. The Blackridges, however, would need maybe 4 cords, and that was being generous. When the first real cold snap hit in November, temperatures dropped to 10 degrees, just as Jonah predicted. Their neighbors had to keep their fires roaring day and night. The Blackridges, on the other hand, lit a small fire in the morning to take the chill off and cook breakfast, then let it die out. "Don't you freeze in there?" a neighbor asked in late November, genuine concern in his voice. He'd already burned through a third of his winter wood supply at an alarming rate. "We're fine," Jonah told him. "Even when it's below zero outside, it stays between 55 and 60 degrees in here. The earth holds the heat." The neighbor just shook his head in disbelief and rode off to chop more wood. December brought heavy snow and even colder temperatures. The Blackridges settled into their winter rhythm. Jonah would wake before dawn, start a small fire, and make breakfast. He'd tend to their horse, Ember, in the small stable built against the hillside, feed the chickens, and check his rabbit snares. Ada managed the household cooking, mending, and reading from their small collection of books. Evenings were spent by the light of their two precious kerosene lamps. Ada would read aloud, or they would talk and dream about the future. Jonah planned to build a proper barn next summer. Ada dreamed of a single, real glass window, facing southeast to catch the morning sun. They were content. They were alone, but not lonely. They were comfortable while others were struggling. But they knew the real test was yet to come. Dakota winters were legendary, and the old-timers warned that this one felt different. The rabbits had thicker fur, the geese flew south earlier than usual, and a strange restlessness hung in the air. On January 11, 1873, the sky turned a peculiar golden gray. The temperature was 15 degrees, not terribly cold, but the wind had shifted to the northwest and was picking up. "Storm's coming," Jonah told Ada. "A big one." They spent the day in a flurry of preparation. Jonah brought Ember into the stable, packing it with extra hay. He moved the chickens into the dugout. He hauled in another week's worth of firewood, stacking it along the walls, and filled every container they had with water from the spring. Ada cooked up a huge pot of bean soup, cornbread, and biscuits, food that could be eaten cold if need be. She checked their supplies: lamp oil, candles, matches, blankets, and their small box of medical supplies. The world outside their small windows vanished into a blur of white. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour. Inside the dugout, the wind was a distant roar, like standing near a waterfall. The thick earth absorbed the storm's fury. "How cold is it out there?" Ada asked, wrapped in a blanket. Jonah forced the door open against the wind. The cold was like a physical blow. 30 below, he said, his face grim. Winds probably 50 miles an hour, maybe more. He knew what that meant. The wind chill was lethal. Anyone caught outside would be dead in minutes. Even in a poorly insulated house, the cold could seep in, slowly draining the life out of you. They tried to sleep, but the howling wind made it impossible. But the earth held. The arched roof held. The stone wall held. The layers of sod and wood that Jonah had so carefully built kept them safe. The second day was even worse. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero, colder than Jonah had ever known. The wind howled with even greater force. Visibility was zero. Jonah cracked the door and could see nothing but a horizontal blizzard of snow. The world had become a white void of wind and cold, a place where a person couldn't survive for more than a few moments. Inside, they stuck to their routine. Small fires, just enough to cook and take the edge off the cold. The temperature in the dugout had fallen to about 42 degrees. It was uncomfortable, requiring layers of clothing and blankets, but it was survivable. They ate bean soup and cornbread. Ada read from Little Women, her voice a steady anchor in the storm, though her thoughts were with their neighbors in their drafty frame houses. Late on that second day, a new sound cut through the roar of the storm. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, a desperate faint cry, almost lost in the blizzard's fury, a sound that had no business being out in that white hell. Jonah and Ada looked at each other, their hearts pounding. Someone was out there. A desperate, frantic banging echoes through the small dugout, fists hammering against the wooden door with the urgency of someone staring death in the face. Jonah grabbed his rifle. You never knew what desperation could drive a person to in a storm this bad. He swung the heavy door open. Two figures, barely recognizable as human, literally collapsed inside. They were so caked in snow and ice, more like walking snowdrifts than people. As Ada slammed the door shut against the howling wind, Jonah realized with a jolt they were their neighbors, Robert and Sarah Chen, homesteaders from 2 miles west. Chinese immigrants who had filed their claim just last spring. "Our house," Robert managed to mumble, his cheeks pale and frostbitten. "The stove. We ran out of firewood. Too cold," Sarah whispered, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Saw the smoke. From your chimney. Had to try." They were both in the grip of severe hypothermia. Ada immediately sprang into action, wrapping them in thick wool blankets. She carefully gave them sips of warm, not hot, soup, and began inspecting their hands and feet for the telltale signs of serious frostbite. The damage was bad. Robert's fingertips were blackened. Sarah's feet were in a terrible state. "You walked 2 miles in this?" Jonah asked, his voice filled with disbelief that they had survived at all. "Crawled part of it," Sarah replied between shivers. "Couldn't see a thing. Just aimed for where we thought you were. We literally ran into the hillside, then felt our way along until we found the door." They had been incredibly lucky. Or maybe it wasn't luck. It was sheer desperation. A primal drive that had pushed them onward when stopping would have meant certain death. The blizzard raged for 3 full days. The 4 of them huddled together in the dugout, carefully rationing their firewood and sharing what food they had. The temperature inside hovered around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Uncomfortable, yes, but with blankets, body heat, and the small stove, they were surviving. Outside, it was a different world. The thermometer read 42 below zero, with wind gusts easily hitting 60 miles per hour. Finally, on the morning of the 4th day, January 15th, the wind began to die down. By noon, it was just a stiff breeze. The air was still a frigid 20 below, but the sun was breaking through the clouds. For the first time in days, they could see farther than a few feet. Jonah opened the door to a world transformed. Snow had drifted into mountains, some 20 feet high, completely burying fence posts and even entire small cabins. The prairie was a stark, white moonscape, carved into bizarre, beautiful shapes by the relentless wind. And in the distance, he could see smoke rising from only a handful of chimneys. "I need to check on the others," he said, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. What he found in the days that followed was pure devastation. Thomas Hutchinson's large frame house had burned to the ground. In a desperate attempt to fight the cold, they'd overfired their stove, and a spark from the chimney had ignited the dry wood. The entire family, all 5 of them, had frozen to death trying to make it to a neighbor's house through the blinding blizzard. The Andersons, a young couple from Minnesota, were found frozen in their own bed, their stove cold, their woodpile empty. The Petersons, the Swensons, the O'Malley's, every family had a story of death or terrible injury. In their immediate area alone, 12 people had perished. Many more suffered from severe frostbite that would cost them fingers, toes, or even limbs. The frame houses that were still standing were badly damaged. Pipes had burst, and roofs had collapsed under the weight of the snow. Families were traumatized, haunted by 3 days of fighting for their lives in homes that offered no real protection. But the Blackridge dugout had remained at a survivable 40 degrees. The Chuns had lived, and as word spread of how Jonah and Ada had weathered the storm, the entire mood of the community began to shift. 3 days after the blizzard broke, a horseman approached. It was Marcus Webb, the land office surveyor, the same man who had ridiculed their dugout design just 9 months before. His face was a mask of the ordeal he'd been through. Hollow eyes, frostbitten cheeks, and the haunted look of a man who had seen death up close. He dismounted stiffly, standing before the dugout, which was barely visible under its thick blanket of snow and soil. All you could see was the stone front wall, the door, and a thin wisp of smoke rising from the chimney pipe. It was a sanctuary in a landscape of death. "Mr. Blackridge, Mrs. Blackridge," Webb said, his voice hoarse as he took off his hat. I owe you an apology. I called you fools. I scoffed at your idea. I told people you'd regret living like badgers in a hole." He swallowed hard. "I was wrong, dead wrong. My own house. We nearly froze. We burned through all our wood by the 2nd day, huddled under every blanket we owned." He held up his bandaged hand. "Lost 2 fingers to frostbite, just trying to get more wood. The Hutchinsons, they're all gone. The Andersons, the Swensons, good people, families with kids, dead, because they built what I told them to build. frame houses that couldn't save them. Jonah nodded slowly, his expression one of shared grief, not triumph. We never wanted to be proven right this way, Marcus. No, Webb agreed, his voice cracking. But you were right. And now I need to learn how you did this, because I'm going to make sure every new homesteader knows there's another way to build, a better way, a way that saves lives. In the following days, others came. Families who had lost loved ones, desperate to understand how the Blackridges had survived. Homesteaders whose homes were destroyed, looking to rebuild, but this time, to build smarter. They wanted to know how to work with the land, not just impose ideas that didn't fit the harsh Dakota environment. The circuit preacher, who had once condemned their ungodly burrow, now stood in their doorway and called it an act of providence, building with wisdom instead of pride. Even the merchants from town, who had once been amused by the Blackridge's hole in the ground, now came asking detailed questions about materials and methods, sensing a chance not for profit, but to help their community. Jonah and Ada shared everything they knew. They taught the basic principles. Earth insulation works because 6 feet of soil maintains a nearly constant temperature year-round. A south-facing home captures the low winter sun while being shielded from the brutal north winds. A curved roof distributes weight evenly, preventing collapse. And thermal masts, the thousands of pounds of earth surrounding the living space, absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly, preventing the deadly temperature swings that occurred in a traditional house. They showed them their building plans, the thickness of the stone walls, the spacing of the timber ribs, the layers of their roof. By spring, 4 more families had begun digging their own earth-sheltered homes. By the following winter, that number had grown to 11. The Blackridge dugout had proven its worth in the most brutal test imaginable, and the frontier was learning. On a mild day in March, Jonah and Ada stood on top of their own roof, looking out as the prairie grass began to turn green. The winter snow was melting, running in harmless rivulets down the sides of their hillside home. "Do you think we changed things?" Ada asked quietly. Jonah thought about the 12 people who died nearby. Across the Dakota Territory, the blizzard had claimed hundreds of lives, but in its aftermath, people were building differently. They were adapting. The old way of thinking was being challenged. Maybe, he said, or maybe the storm changed things, and we were just here to show there was another way. Below them, their horse grazed peacefully, their chickens scratched in the dirt. Inside their home, the stove was cold, they didn't need it. The earth was still holding the last of winter's warmth, and come summer, that same earth would keep them cool as temperatures outside soared. They had built something that worked with the land, not against it. They had endured ridicule, loneliness, and the worst storm the Dakotas could throw at them. In doing so, they had saved 2 lives and shown everyone that survival on the frontier required ingenuity, humility, and sometimes the courage to be called a fool. The dugout stood as part of the hill, almost invisible to anyone who didn't know it was there. Just a low stone wall, a rounded door, and a slim chimney pipe. That simple home would stand for 30 years before the family built a larger house nearby. And even then, they kept the dugout, using it for storage, for shelter, and as a reminder of their first home on the Dakota prairie. Some of the other dugouts built that year would last even longer. A few still standing into the next century, silent monuments to the homesteaders who learned to build, not against the land, but with it. Jonah and Ada walked down the hill together, toward the first wildflowers of spring. Behind them, their home was nestled into the earth, warm in winter, cool in summer. Proof that sometimes true wisdom is doing what everyone else calls madness. The wind swept across the grass on their roof, and to any passerby, it looked like nothing more than another hillside, which of course was the whole idea. Thanks for watching. If this story of resilience and ingenuity inspired you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from history.
If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next ones. We'll meet again on Hill Destiny with another tale. Take